Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another conversation in practical theology. My name is Sayyyidah Zaidi, and I'm really honoured to be sharing this platform with Dr. Eric Stoddart. Eric is going to introduce himself as well.
Yes, I'm a teacher of practical theology here in Scotland at the University of St Andrews. I've been involved in practical theology now for formally about probably 20 years since I did my PhD. Prior to that, I was a minister in one of the more conservative denominations. I'm now a lay member of one of the more liberal denominations.
Gosh, that's an excellent summary. And I'm a student of the Doctorate in Practical Theology at Glasgow University. Kind of interesting journey to where I am with my faith, and I think some of that's going to come up in today's discussion as well, because we're looking at women and gender issues. In a couple of days' time, it's going to be International Women's Day, and that always kind of raises some interesting questions about the roles of women and, in brackets, and men in faith. And so I suppose let me kind of open up this conversation by sharing what my faith means to me. And I think a lot of people have an interesting perspective about Islam and women, and they think, Muslim women are oppressed, and, you wear the headscarf, there's a man telling you to wear this, and all of the, you can do this and you can't do that. And yeah, there are rules in place, but actually, for me, believe that my faith liberates me because, for example, women were given rights of ownership of property within Islam 1400 years ago. And if we look at the history of property ownership within the West, this is only something that's happened in the last 100 years. That's one example. There is no compulsion in religion. And so for me, my faith comes from me rather than someone forcing me to be within a particular faith. And I think the other kind of thing that I always find interesting is when women get married and they change their surnames. And when you look at the history of some of this stuff, it's because in Western cultures, even up to 100 years ago, when a woman got married to a man, she became, and her property became the ownership of that man, and it might be slightly controversial, but I think that we even see kind of like elements of that within the royal family and within aristocracy existing within the UK today. And so, for example, when I got married, I didn't change my name, and it causes so many issues when you turn up to the airport and your kids have got a different surname from you. But I'm very confident and comfortable in who I am. And I think that I would like to think that as a woman, my relationship with God is of far more importance than some of the kind of the day-to-day logistical things that might get in the way. And I think that my relationship with God actually serves how I am with my friends and with my family and also with humanity.
Yeah, the practical issues around gender are just so immense. And I'm very conscious that, speaking from a privileged position, certainly in UK society as a white male, to even start talking about gender is to... Can I end up doing that from a position of privilege inadvertently? That to me, it would be paralysing. So I've got, as a practical theologian, I've just got to leap in there, try and be conscious of the privilege that I'm living in and try and contribute something to debate. So as a practical theologian who's a white male in a predominantly Christian ethos type society, I maybe have only one leg to stand on. Let's put it that way. But I think, for me, Christian faith and gender has had such a mixed history. I think, I think what struck me really was once seeing paintings down in the catacombs in Rome. It was on a TV program, and they were they seem to be clearly depicting women in a significant leadership role at a communion service in the Christian tradition. And this being denied historically by elements of the church. And to me, saying, actually, if I want to go back to my Christian biblical roots, there seems to be an awful lot more of a positive understanding of the role of women, and not necessarily gender, because I don't think they would have understood that term, but the role of women was certainly much more honoured in certain aspects of the early Christian texts. And maybe we're trying to rediscover some of that. So there's a little bit, for me, of a process of how can I be involved in that recovery, retrieval process of the dignity of women when my own traditions have quite often, to say the least, not been helpful.
Mm. Do you think that there's an element of just kind of drawing the line under history, let's say, learning from it and then moving on? Because inside my head, that's what I'm trying to do. There are issues globally with how women are treated, and you know, we can clearly kind of contribute to that debate by saying something, but actually it's through our actions and through how we live our lives as men and women that will change the future.
I think for you to draw a line for parts of your history is absolutely valid. I don't think I can draw a line on anyone else's behalf. And that would make me conscious. Again, it's back to this thing of white male privilege, that if I start trying to draw lines in history, that's potentially excluding voices that I don't want to hear, that I don't want to deal with. But if others want to draw a line in history and move on and become engaged and deal with the present, I absolutely want to support that. Mm. But I don't want to be drawing lines, even inadvertently, on behalf of other people over their history.
But can you, I suppose the question then is, can you draw a line under the contribution? I mean, because in many respects, I don't know whether you agree with this or not, but in many respects, the kind of the history of a white male-dominated approach to women hasn't always been positive, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so is there something to say that rather than kind of responding to the baggage that comes with that, is there an opportunity for the line to be drawn? And I'm saying that metaphorically, so that the starting point is a different one. Because for me, what I find is that when I'm responding, and I'm talking personally here, but when I'm responding to a lot of negativity that has happened in the past, actually it makes the job of creating a new kind of flourishing and thriving situation so much harder, because your starting place is in the minuses. Whereas if I just say, look, this is who I am, this is where we are, and let's try and change the rules and make it much more positive.
I admire that, because you're absolutely right. We could spend forever digging over history, and all our energies would go in to be trying to retrieve different things from history. And if there is the space to say, right, this is where we find ourselves, how are we going to deal with the present? Let's get on with the actual issues that need to be tackled right in here and now, almost regardless of the history of them. That's for another time. That's for when there's maybe space to do that. I like that approach. I suppose I'm just conscious that I don't want to, in any sense, impose that approach on others. But if they want to do that, great.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree with you. I know that what I'm saying can be interpreted controversially, and I'm not denying history, because I think that, you know, even if I look at my own life, there are things that I've done in my life that I'm not proud of, but they have made me who I am as a human being. Mm-hmm. And so those experiences, and I think that God kind of, as an individual, God gives us those experiences and those opportunities to learn to make us who we are today, and those things will carry on. Right. So maybe what has happened within the world, is that a lot of things that have happened that, are horrific and we would not want to experience again. But it has brought us to this point now, and now's the time where we maybe think about what do we do next. Because even if you look at all of the stuff that's happening globally about the Me Too campaign and how or the role of women within society and female role models and all of this kind of stuff, I think we're kind of like standing on a cliff. And there's some really, really interesting stuff that's going to come in the next decade or two. I have no idea what it is, but some of that will be informed by faith. Some of it will also be informed by an empowerment movement, and some of it will be informed by feminism.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, it's about what actions am I able to take? Am I willing to take? How am I going to respond to people that I encounter in terms of issues of gender? That theologically I may have lots of different arguments about it and concepts and theories, but actually although that's important, the more important thing is in my responsibility for my encounters with actual people. Absolutely. And what does that really mean? And that, to me, I find that much more challenging, because I love the intellectual sort of diverse going around the houses and coming back again and exploring something and seeing its roots. But that can actually be, for me, a distraction from doing the better thing.
I mean, I agree with you completely, because, I try to avoid the kind of dialogue about feminism, and I think it's important to kind of cover that within this conversation, mm-hmm. because for me, feminism is a reaction, right? And actually, everyone's kind of definition of feminism is also very different. Mm-hmm. So I could say feminism means X, you would say it means Y, and everyone else that's listening, it means something completely different to them. That's why, for me, I try in the work that I'm doing as a student of practical theology and a student of faith is not to use words that I know are loaded. And I think that feminism is one of those. And sometimes when people fire that word off, all of a sudden everybody just gets tense, rather than thinking, actually, as you say, what are the practical things that need to get done? And one of the things that I've started to do, which is really interesting, actually, just watching other people's reactions to this, is that in Islam, God has no gender, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I speak about God, unless I'm tripping myself up and I forget, I actually say he or she. And it's that you get so much understanding of how a person is from the way that they respond to that, because they look and they're like, did she really say that? Absolutely, because for me, God has no gender. And if I attribute God as being male, that is just kind of reinforcing a lot of the kind of subtle, unspoken about references to men being better than women.
Yes, and because I'm rarely leading in public worship of any sort, I don't encounter that as much as I might have done in my previous role as a minister, and facing the challenge of using both gender pronouns or none to refer to God. It's sometimes doing it, if it's in a classroom setting, not in a context of worship, I might do it with a little sticky prod and a poke at people just to get a reaction. I'm not sure if that's really very honourable, but yeah, it can be fun sometimes.
I think it makes people think. I mean, mm-hmm. I personally don't think it's wrong, because if it starts the conversation about who is God, mm-hmm. actually, in my opinion, one becomes closer to God, even if they're reacting against the fact that you've said, actually, God has no gender. Right. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps it makes them think again, because it's very easy, the majority of the literature and the majority of the holy books, they refer to God as he, mm-hmm. right? And, you can kind of I'm not even going to say understand it, but you can see why that happened when you look at the way that writing was in history. But we're in a different place now, and there's so much more understanding of the sources of the different faiths. And if your faith says that God has no gender, then really, I think, it's a responsibility upon us to think about what that means for us, because, I would like to have a relationship with God, right? And if God tells us that she has no gender, why am I putting that on God?
Yeah, you see, I think
me.
That's the fascinating point. Why do we each want to gender God? And there's issues there about, once we start asking ourselves, why is it so important to me that God is either referred to as he or not referred to as he, referred to as she or definitely not referred to as she? That tells us something about ourselves, I think. And it's always going to come back, I think, to power. If we think that there's a power that we can somehow frame God in a way that is powerful by giving God a gender, whether that's male or female, then we can somehow be on the side of that power. And it's reinforcing our desire of power over people. Or maybe we can have more influence if we've got God on our side, if God is gendered, even though we know God isn't gendered.
Yeah. You see, it's interesting you saying that, because you're making me kind of like think about why I want God to be genderless and kind of like engage with that. Because I think I don't want to talk about God as he or she, because that is then me giving him her even more power, because I don't know. There's very few descriptions within Islam of what God is as an entity, but as a Muslim, for me, she, God isn't a being in the same way as we are, right? And I think that when I start to think about God as, let's say, with a male or female pronoun, all of a sudden I think that I can relate to God better, and maybe it then makes me less, how can I say, less consistent or less challenging within my faith, and makes me question less about how can I actually then be closer to God.
And for me, it's the part of the problem is the depth and weight of Christian tradition that has talked of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being God, and the male figure of Jesus being taken to be divine, and the Holy Spirit is the sort of non-gendered figure in the Trinity. But that's really bad theology to think of God gendered, but the Christian tradition is so heavily weighted towards those particular patriarchal and male framings that it adds an extra layer of resistance to think of what those gender issues actually are, because I'm so steeped in that. And I know there's volumes and volumes of Christian theology about the nature of the Trinity and all of that, and my head just explodes when I even start to try and read it. And it's just not a thing that I get into. I'm much more interested in, like I say, why do we want to gender God? How does the gendering of God work? The philosophical arguments around about it are just way, way beyond anything that I can get my head around.
Yeah, I mean, is it easy to say that if we attach a male gender to God, then it's easier to control women? Because sadly, I think a lot of faith is used to control women, and things get interpreted in particular ways without really looking at the sources. And so, for example, in Islam, women are able to have leadership roles. It's been very clearly defined. And when we look at, even Mary, is venerated within Islam, and we speak about what they call the mothers of the believers, and they're very, very amazing, strong role models. And so the kind of, dare I say, the literature within Islam consists of two things. You've got the Quran and the Hadith. And the Hadith are kind of documented sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. They have kind of like been come all the way down from his time to now. And if you change one word, all of a sudden it becomes it becomes a weak or not a strong Hadith. And so there's millions of books that are available that document these and take us right back 1400 years. Now, the majority of these sayings are available to us today because of the narration of women. And if they did not exist, we wouldn't have such strong Hadith. And it's really incredible that, in some of the Hadith studies that I've done, some of the scholars have even said that, if we didn't have particular women documenting the Hadith, we wouldn't have, 50-60% of what is available today. And yet within the scholarly circles right now, one of the biggest challenges that I think Muslims are facing is that there is a 1,000,001 male scholars, but an insufficient number of female scholars. And that has happened not because women don't want to learn, it's happened because there isn't as much opportunity for women to learn. And again, I think that we're kind of like just literally standing on the edge of a cliff where things are changing. And
in practical theology, the balance of genders is remarkably different to it is in most other, certainly Christian theological, biblical guilds. Because even just a quick guess of practical theology, if it's not 50-50, it's pretty close to it. And certainly in some practical theology contexts, women are the majority. In publications in practical theology as a journal, it's not 50-50, but I think I did a quick scan for something a year ago, and it's not far off being equal. And I think that is important because it's representative, it's making a statement. But on the other hand, if it's about gender related to power, isn't it more important that we tackle how someone is using their gender for issues of power over others, whether or not it's their female gender or male gender?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, because women have an equal opportunity to step into their power and to use that role. And I'm thinking that one of the things that we need to try and come back to is humanity, right? And of course, God made men and women different, right? We can't deny that. And so we have a different kind of physical and psychological makeup, but that doesn't mean that you can't lead from different perspectives, or you can't kind of study from different roles, etc., etc. And I suppose one of the biggest challenges that I've faced as a student of practical theology is the push that I've had to always speak about my work from a female perspective, and I get that. I know my perspective will be different, and so that's where the reflexivity comes in. But I've always been asked to write about the research in terms of does it fit into, or where does the feminist agenda fit into it, or how does the role of women affect what I'm trying to do? And I think that I've actually I ended up spending a lot of time just kind of saying, whilst that's important, that's not what my research is about. And I think that it's made me think that there is a huge space, even today, with the great work that's been done previously about feminism and women's studies and the role of women in practical theology, there still is a huge space for women of non-Christian faiths to start looking at these issues and bringing in those conversations, so that there is a contribution from that angle.
And I wonder what you make of, because you and I have talked about gender as if it's binary. Now, in some ways, we need to do that at least to get a conversation underway, because it gets so complicated. But actually, if gender is a social construct and it's not binary, where does that move the discussion in terms of practical theology?
See, I don't think gender is binary. I think, I mean, I look at my kids. My kids were born 18 months apart. And so whenever I bought toys, I never bought boys' toys or girls' toys. I just bought toys, never separated them. And it was just fascinating to me watching my kids playing with these things, because when they got to about 4 or 5, my daughter started to play with girls' toys and my son started to play with what we would call boys' toys. And there was no influence on that for me. You know, I take both of my kids to football, both of my kids knit, and all of these other crazy things, you know, that one would say is gender specific. But I think there's something within our DNA as humans that gives that that expresses itself through our actions. So, for example, as a female, I will approach things or certain things slightly differently from a male, and there is nothing that I can do about that. I know that that's just the way that God has created me. What I find gone.
I'm just saying, I suppose that I'm much more of a social constructionist when I understand gender. That I'm not sure about this this DNA level, the essentialized male, female. That yes, biological sex, there are two, but of course are intersex people as well. But gender, I think, is, for me, it's so socially constructed that, you know, the way you're describing your kids growing up is that social construction of gender that's not binary. That's a social construction almost in itself.
I think you're right in social construction, but I think it's not 100%. I suppose is what I'm trying to say, because I think that, you know, and again, you know, I can only speak about my example, but when I look at the kind of family setup that I have, you know, both me and my husband work from home, we homeschool the kids. We equally share the responsibilities of the house, and we equally share the responsibilities of work, you know. And even when I got married, I remember, in fact, before we got married, I remember one of the questions I asked my husband was, you know, how would you feel if your wife earns more money than you? Now, some may think that that's a controversial question, but I know that within a lot of marriages, and I'm talking across all faiths, if a woman earns more than a man, the man can feel that he's not able to be the one that wears the trousers in the house, you know. And it's fascinating looking at these things, because from my perspective, it makes no difference who does the task or brings the money or whatever, as long as everything gets done.
Yeah, and I think it's not until something destabilizes our perspective do we actually realize maybe how binary we are thinking in terms of gender, that it needs someone in our life to be challenging what we had just assumed to be the norm. And that then puts us into a new position of having to say, well, what do I think if my partner earns more than me? And The Big Bang Theory, the TV show, managed to get at least one whole episode out of the dynamics of that. And it's a standard comedic, but deeply serious issue about unpacking and encountering our own sense of gender.
Yeah. And I mean, even to the point where I remember one day coming back from work. So I used to be a director in local government. So I had a very big responsibility and a huge budget and, you know, multiple people that I was responsible for. And I remember just kind of like standing at the door one day and thinking, I am not the boss in this house. And then opening the door, because if I went in as the director in local government, actually it would have just messed up the family dynamic. And it, you know, I think it's important within any relationship to have respect, right? And I don't think I don't. It's interesting actually. Yes, Islam gives men and women different roles, and there are certain things that I can ask my husband to do, and there's certain things that he can ask me to do. But at the end of the day, there's nothing to say that men are better than women or women are better than men, you know. And I think for me, that's very clearly written in the Quran, because whenever there's a reference to kind of actions of worship, the verbs that are used, or the nouns, I should say, that are used, describe men and women, you know. So one can't say that because I'm doing X, Y, and Z, I'm better than you. But sadly, within the practicality of life, that's sometimes what happens, because we've not spent time thinking about this.
And I think it again comes back to how we manage our relationships in terms of how we understand how we're going to practice power, how we're reacting to someone else's power over us. And I'm not even sure for me if it's always gender that's the most prominent issue, because I can be really intimidated by someone with a certain type of accent. That in an academic setting, I know that inside me, I will defer to the person with an Oxbridge type accent. Because if they've got that sort of accent, they must be brighter than me. And that it doesn't matter what gender they are. And then conscious that if I speak into that setting with a Scottish accent, what are they thinking about me? Maybe that's unfair, but it's about class for me, sometimes even more so than gender, certainly in an academic setting.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, you know, this whole discussion about accent, because I literally just came back from a trip to the States. And so, you know, despite growing up in a council house, despite, you know, having numerous challenges as I was growing up, I have a very kind of like Queen's English accent. I lived in Glasgow for 10 years, but no one could ever tell. Right? So you turn up to America and everyone, they're completely mesmerized. And I remember going into a cafe once to order a sandwich, and it was the only way I can describe it is it was the guy serving me had fallen in love with me, because he was just like in complete shock. And I was thinking, this is just a voice. You cannot judge based on an accent or based on color or based on gender. And maybe that's what we're coming down to, is just saying it's about the essence of the person rather than about the physical baggage that they carry.
And as practical theologians, being trained to be reflexive, understanding what is it that triggers my unnecessary deference to people with an Oxbridge accent in an academic context. Or, more negatively for me, if I hear someone with a very broad Scottish accent that's not associated with learned discourse, I'm having to work to get over that, my prejudice. And that shocks me, even to have to admit that to myself, let alone here. But it's because it's so ingrained. And I think there's something about accents and class that also tells us about gender, whether it's binary, whether it's socially constructed. Our reactions to this it's really difficult sometimes to get a handle on how we're reacting, because it's in the moment.
I mean, what's fascinating for me about what you've just said is that a long time ago, I once said to somebody, I said, you know, as human beings, we all have prejudice, and they were horrified. And I said this because actually we all do have prejudice. It's when we have an awareness of what our prejudice is that we can actually kind of contribute to humanity more. You know, I will always love a Scottish accent because I lived in Glasgow for so long. And so for me, it feels as if it's my second home. The French accent makes everyone melt, etc., etc. There's certain accents that I don't like. I won't say what they are in case anyone's listening. You know, but it's fascinating how we have both positive and negative prejudices, and yet society teaches us, or is trying to train us, to ignore those prejudices and treat everybody as equal. And we can strive to do that, but somewhere within us, there will be something that says you prefer that person because of this and you don't like that person because of that.
Yeah, and from a faith perspective, knowing that in the New Testament there's an identification of the disciples of Jesus. Well, how can they know anything? Because they're Galileans. They sound like Galileans. And that is just so authentic to how human relations are. But within the Christian tradition, the experience that, when people play Jesus in movies, they tend to have a very standard accent.
Mm.
And I think that creates for me an image of God that certainly in the New Testament, Jesus was probably speaking with a very broad regional accent. But you wouldn't get the impression that that's how Jesus spoke from the Book of Common Prayer, from the King James Bible, or in any most Christian churches. And I think there's something strange there about how within the Christian community we're enculturating each other. Not both in terms of gender, yes, but also in terms of class and language. That I'm not sure we're entirely conscious of how that is so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's fascinating for me is, if you look at where Jesus lived his life, he was Arab. No one can deny that. And yet, when you look at how he is portrayed in movies, it's usually an American or European, and, there's no real regard for his actual ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I think one of the conversations that we could come onto in the future is actually just about race and faith. I think there's just so much kind of rich material there to look at. And I know that we could talk about gender issues for all day. There's so much to cover here. I think what's interesting about this conversation is we've touched some unexpected angles on the issues of gender and faith. And I think there's still so much more to explore, but hopefully this is a good contribution to those discussions. Is there anything that you'd like to say just to before we draw this to a close?
I think just probably to re-emphasize the challenge that I find as a practical theologian to understanding what I expect in this gender discussion and my encounter with people. How is practical theology helping me, not just as an academic, but as a human being, to be more conscious of how gender is operating as a power mechanism? But that's many days discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, I mean, I'm always looking at how my faith empowers me as a woman, because I think that we live in a time where it can be quite hard to be a woman living today. And I think that I've got to look at whatever source of inspiration and solace and strength, I suppose, I can draw from, and that will clearly influence what I write as a student in practical theology. But at the same time, I think there's something there has to be an element of this that is genderless, and I think it's exploring that relationship and seeing what can come from there. But, like you say, we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. Eric, thank you so much for another wonderful conversation in practical theology. This is Sayyiddah Zaidi saying thank you so much for everybody who's been watching. If you have any contributions or any comments that you'd like to make, just comment below this video and we'll come back to you with any kind of responses or any answers that we may be able to give you. At the end of the day, we're all on this journey as well. So thank you so much for watching.
And thank you, everyone. This has been Eric Stoddart. And be nice in the comments, please.
Yeah, absolutely.